Good afternoon. Today is April 29th in the year 2020. It is a Wednesday, and we're going to restart after some technical difficulties yesterday discussing Genesis. Primarily, we are going to be focusing on Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 26. This is sometimes referred to as the primeval prologue. It is the part of Genesis that deals with the events that affect all human beings, before beginning to focus solely on the line of Abraham. There are a couple of things we want to do as we approach these stories. First, we want to take them seriously. These are stories about theology, regarding the nature of God, human beings, the world, and how all of those things interact. However, we acknowledge that the writers in antiquity were smart. They understood things like plants don't grow without sunshine. They understood that Genesis chapter 1 does not and is not compatible with Genesis chapter 2. We make the mistake of thinking about these things in modern scientific terms, and that's not what they're for. Rather, these things are for theological purposes. It would be better if we thought of them as parables, if we thought of them as instructional material rather than blueprints on how to build a universe. We do not think that there really was a rich man who had a beggar named Lazarus outside his door. Therefore, there is no reason for us to believe that the events of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, are intended to represent actual events. It is theology. And we can neither dismiss them as merely ancient myth, nor so hold them that we fail to use our God-given intellect and senses. Both of those paths are incorrect. Nor do they need to somehow be reconciled to modern science. Science that deals with creation and evolution are not the same thing as the stories in Genesis. They have different purposes. Our purpose is to see the theology behind these chapters. There are 6 stories or accounts, or in Hebrew, toledotes, and what we were going to look at. We're going to begin with Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 3, the 7 days of creation. If you will look at the language carefully, we will be stopping frequently so that we can get the full impact of the story. I know some of you may have heard me speak on this subject before, but as you will come to see, it is one that I am fairly passionate about. I think it is important. I do not think we can simply forget them. We need to read them and understand them. So, let's look at Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 1 is in many ways a heading. It is the title of this section. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It is not till verse 2 that we begin the story. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Notice that in these stories, there are questions that we might have that are not answered. And they will not be answered because they are not important to the point. Here we have an earth described that is, in Hebrew, tohu wabohu, formless and void, empty, shapeless, like a lump of clay that has not been shaped. There is potential, but now it is nothing. But it is there. Where did it come from? We're not told. Why was it made? We're not told. Just that it exists. God exists and this lump of matter. Nothing else is explained. We have the image of the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. The waters are this rolling mass of earth. We have God waiting as an artist about to put brush to canvas to begin shaping, creating what he's going to make. And unlike in the mythologies of the ancient Near East, God's creation process is not violent. There is no war, no slaying of dragons, no birth even. Rather, it is very simple. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. God creates by speaking. One of the purposes of this chapter of Genesis is to show the majesty and power of God, especially in contrast to the gods of the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, etc., of the ancient world. God speaks. It is enough. It is a simple thing. Also, we want to be aware that the word here used for God is Elohim. Anytime you see an I-M on the end of a Hebrew word, that means plural. It's like the S on the end of an English word. However, the use of the plural for God, and later in the language of "let us go down," probably are most likely understood to suggest the majesty of God. It is a royal type of plurality. It does not mean the Trinity. The writers of Genesis chapter 1 would have had no concept of a Trinity. And even if they were somehow led to write it, they would not have understood it that way. And so we will not interpret it that way. I do not believe that this is some holdover from some earlier polytheistic version of the story. God in this story is so alone, so unique. It is not a multitude of voices saying, "Let there be light." It is one. So when we speak of Elohim, when we speak of God as plural, we speak of God as majestic. The plurality of it is simply the best way we as limited beings can express it. On this first day, God begins creation by separation. That will be consistent with what he does the first, second, and third day. God separates the light from the dark. He sees that the light is good. You can think of the first 3 days of creation as God building a house. These are rooms to put things in. There is a room that is called light, and there is a room that is called dark. And later, on the parallel day, on day 4, he will begin putting things in them. It says, "There is evening and there is morning the first day." There's no sunshine. There's no moon. There's no stars. There is no evening and morning. And we would immediately begin to understand that this is poetic language. It is intended to be taken as such. This passage is beautiful in Hebrew. The parallels, the word usage is all fascinating. And the original readers and the original editors of this book knew what they were doing. We strain ourselves unnecessarily when we try to describe the days of Genesis. It is simply God did this and then it was over. God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. More separation. First day is light and dark. The second day, the water above and the water below. The water above, we are told, is sky. Clouds. Again, we think of these as rooms, and we will see who inhabits them. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place. Let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. He has subdivided the waters below. A big room has become two, land and sea. God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees, and land that bear fruit with seed in them, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. Now we have a secondary act of creation to end day 3. God begins to put furniture in the room. He creates vegetation. Now, of course, from a modern perspective, we see vegetation as just as living as insects or people. But in the ancient mind, they didn't have active mobility. They moved, but they didn't move around in the same way living things did. And so the ability to move was part of the quality of life. In the ancient world, vegetation would be different than those things that seem to move on their own. Now that we completed building the house, we'll begin to let the inhabitants come to live in it. God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. Let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. Let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give a light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning the 4th day. Now we actually have a sun and moon, so that evening and morning would even be possible. We may not think of the sun and moon and stars as living things, but certainly the ancient world did. Thought of them as gods, thought of them as powers that had great influence over daily life. But to the writer of Hebrews, they're clocks, they're lamps. They are living in the sense that they do seem to move on their own, or certainly in ways the ancient writer wouldn't understand. But they're not God, nor do they have power over human beings. They have 2 purposes: to provide light and to keep time. Sure, judge the stars to know when your spring planting should happen, but don't look to them to guide your life. In the place of Ra, in the place of the powers of the world seen by the Egyptians and the Babylonians, the sun and moon are no more important than the animals that he will make on the fifth day. And God said, "Let the waters teem with living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth according to the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which water teems according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." There was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. On the second day of creation, we had the water above, which we got called sky, the water below, which got separated into land and sea, and now we have inhabitants for the water above and the water below. The water above is the sky, and birds and flying things live in it. The water below is the sea, and all kinds of fish and teeming things live there. Inhabitants for the rooms God built. Now we approach the sixth day. And just as the third day had a primary creation and a secondary creation, with in some sense the secondary creation being more important than the primary one, so too on the sixth day. God said, "Let the land produce living creatures, according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over the livestock, over all the earth and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. To all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. It's a busy day. In addition to creating all manner of earthly creatures, God makes something special, a pinnacle of creation. We've already talked about the plurality of God, saying, "Let us go down." And what does God make? Male and female, he made them. Humanity. He gives them everything that grows upon the earth that has seed in it for food. Notice here, no Adam and Eve, no separate creation of Eve, no forbidding to eat of a certain tree. Everything. Male and female created at the same time. The story of Genesis chapter 1 is about God's magnificence, God's power, God's creation. And human beings are given a special place in that creation and made in the image of God. And it is not something that they lose. We don't know exactly what the image of God is, but we know that it is reinforced over and over again in the Old Testament as the reason for human life being valuable. Murder is a violation of the image of God. We see that at the end of the story of Noah and the ark. And we will look at that again in a little bit. This is a story about the universe being an orderly place that is good. God did not make a bad place and punish people to live in it. God made a good place, and all of it is good. Matter is good. Material world is good. We may act to corrupt it, but it has an intrinsic value that is protected under the law, and we see that in things like Sabbath days and Sabbath years and Jubilee. That even the land and the animals are allowed to rest. And that's why we culminate this passage with a few verses in chapter 2. Thus the heavens and earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day God had finished the work he had done, so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There are profound theological truths in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 1, it does not require us to believe that these were events that literally happened exactly as described. I don't even think that the writer intended that. They are intended to teach us about God and our place in the world. It says we are to rule, but there's that word has responsibility applied to it. We may be the ones with the power over everything, but we're also the ones with the responsibility over everything. This passage was written not to explain how do human beings get here, but rather what is the relationship of creation to God. And it's clear God is the creator. Everything is subjected under him. Nothing that we might worship as God is God, except for he alone, who is before and is uncreated. Next time we will look at the maybe more familiar and more personal story that begins in Genesis chapter 2. Where Genesis chapter 1 was about Elohim, the majestic and powerful creator God. Genesis chapter 2 and following are about Yahweh, the personal and loving God that interacts in a very intimate way with his creation. It is about relationships and how they are flawed when we fail to live in communion with God. If you have questions, please send them to me. I love this section of Genesis, and there is so much more that we could talk about than what I have done. So I hope you'll join me. I don't know how long this study will take. I don't know how far we'll go, but I think it will be interesting. Until then, I hope that God speaks to you and moves you to re-examine Scripture, to think about it seriously, and to struggle with it when you need to. God bless you. Amen.